this is a wonderful event. I'm Natalie Thill, and I direct the Adirondack Center for Writing. We are an organization that does programs for readers and writers and storytellers throughout the whole region. We have a reputation for being program heavy. We do a lot of programs, and that fact has not changed at all during the entire this whole COVID period. We never skipped a beat. We have a very robust calendar of events right now. We have writing workshops and one-on-one manuscript critiques. And next, on March 19th, we have our next virtual Howl Story Slam that we do with NCPR. So we've been working hard to make sure that people feel creative and inspired and connected at a time where maybe they're feeling a little isolated and maybe a little brain dead. In addition to being program heavy, we are also known for all of our collaborations. We have collaborated with just about every entity in the Adirondack region, many of whom are here now. I want to give a shout out to Adirondack Life. They're here, and North Country Public Radio. We've really enjoyed all our collaborations, and this is our first collaboration with Adirondack Explorer. And it has been a real pleasure working with Tracy Ormsby. We have been working on this for a couple of years now, and more recently with Rex to design tonight's program. We're really proud of it. We think it's going to be extraordinary. So sit back and relax and enjoy it. And I'm going to turn this all over to the Adirondack Explorer publisher, who is Tracy Ormsby. Thanks again.
Thank you, Natalie. And it's been really great working with you and with Bailey. And you're right, a joint project between our two organizations is long overdue. I want to say thanks to all of you for joining us. And we're so excited to share with you this group of all-star journalists. All but two of them are members of the Adirondack Explorer Board of Directors. I'm grateful for their leadership in our mission to use independent journalism to celebrate and protect the Adirondack Park. Brian Mann is not part of our board of directors, but we're coming for you next, Brian. But he's been reporting in the North Country for more than 20 years with North Country Public Radio, and more recently, he's joined National Public Radio as a reporter. Also with us is Brandon Loomis. He, of course, is the Explorer's editor, and any of you who subscribe or have been following our work have certainly noticed the positive impact he's had on our news report. Brandon's also on vacation this week, so an extra thanks to him for being with us tonight. We also have retired head of the Associated Press and Explorer chairman, Tom Curley, reporting fellow with Type Investigations, author, and Saranac Lake native, Adam Federman. Please wave when I say your name too. Retired Orlando Sentinel editor, Charlotte Hall, Chief Commercial Officer and Senior Vice President of Digital Publishing for Hearst Newspapers, Bridget Williams, New York Times contributor and author, Robert Worth, and leading our discussion, but we hope also contributing to this evening's conversation as a story journalist himself, Rex Smith. I worked with Rex Smith for 14 years when he was editor of the Times Union, and I can't think of a better person to lead a discussion of the importance of journalism in a time when truth itself is in peril. He talks about such things every week on Northeast Public Radio's The Media Project, and has been a national leader in efforts to create a news literacy curriculum for high schools and colleges. So thank you so much, Rex, for leading us tonight.
Well, thank you, Tracy, and thanks to all these fine journalists for joining us this evening and making this possible. And thank you to the people, the many people who have joined us. This is really just a wonderful turnout for this conversation. And I just want to take a moment to sort of set the stage for our conversation with the thoughts about where we are right now. You know, those of us on this panel are engaged in what's nowadays being called the reality-based media. That term isn't said to differentiate us from, say, the movies or advertising, as it might have been in prior years, but reality-based media is different because it differentiates us from organizations that intentionally distort the news for political ends, and that is a growing segment. Even as the so-called legacy media, newspapers and TV and commercial radio, suffer unprecedented declines. So that presents a challenge for all of us in the media. You can blame the digital revolution, blame the decline in trust generally in the media, blame the economic impact of the pandemic this year. But whatever multiple factors are to blame, these are tough days for the news media. And that's what sets us apart right now. The digital revolution really has robbed the legacy media of advertising dollars. That's sort of the fundamental here, that used to provide 3/4 of the revenue that supported journalism, at least in newspapers. Digital ads, which everybody has been chasing, can't really replace those lost print ads, because after all, 70% of US digital advertising dollars go to just 3 companies: Google, Facebook, and Amazon. That leaves very little for all the rest of us scrambling around for that remaining little 30%. And the result has been tragic for those who care about and who believe that journalism can have an impact in our communities. In the last 15 years, according to University of North Carolina research, 25% of American newspapers have died over the last 15 years. That is, the newspapers that were existing 15 years ago, 1/4 of them are gone now. And perhaps 2,000 newspapers that had their own newspapers as recently as 2004, which to some of us seems like yesterday. These are now, those 2,000 communities are now news deserts. There is no independent source to track what's going on, to be the watchdog, even give people information on where to find what's happening. And this has come at the same time as there's been a marked decline in trust in the media, as in every other institution. Almost 6 in 10 people now believe that the news media intentionally lie to them. That's what they also say. About that same number say that about politicians and business leaders. So I guess we have misery loves company. But it's especially true of a certain classification of people among Trump voters, people who self-identified as supporting former President Trump last year. 8 in 10 believe that the news media are intentionally misleading them to publish things that aren't true. So against that bleak backdrop, here's the imperative. We live in an ever more complex world that desperately needs the truth telling that we on this panel have committed our careers to providing. But it's getting harder and harder month by month to execute on this plan. And so that really is why we're here. I didn't intend to go on quite so long, but there are lots of problems. And once I started talking about them, it went on. That's what we're here to talk about: how we can shape a media ecosystem for the future that serves the needs of our communities, because that's, I think, fundamental for American life right now. That's just the view of this upstate American. So let me just think, we thought that maybe a good way to launch this conversation about the challenges that we confront now in the second decade of the 21st century in the media is to talk to these journalists about the difficulty of telling some of the important stories. And so we've asked some of them to think about stories that were significant in their lives, that they, in their careers, that they might have to report differently, that might be received differently now. So let me start with Charlotte Hall. I used to work for Charlotte. In my youth, I was a reporter at this wonderful newsroom downstate at Newsday. Charlotte was my editor for a while, and she became the managing editor before she was editor of the Orlando Sentinel. So Charlotte, think back, if you would please, and kick us off on something that was significant that you think would have to be told differently or might be received differently right now.
Okay, thanks, Rex. Oh, am I like echoing strangely?
Nope, you're good.
Am I okay?
You're...
Okay.
Yep.
Well, thank you. And I've been around a long time. This story is 30 years old, so that gives you an idea. And this was a story that set me on a journey, which I'm still on. And it's been a long and intermittent journey, but and interestingly, the paper is still on that same journey. It was a story called a project called Segregation on Long Island. And we spent a probably more than a year interviewing primarily African Americans on the island, studying the situation. Very little was really being written about residential segregation up north at that point. But Long Island was a place built on racial covenants after World War II. Levittown, you could not be Black and live in Levittown. And systemic racism, we didn't call it that in those days, and nowadays we would, but systemic racism infected every part of Long Island life, from schools to housing to social interaction, jobs, policing, healthcare, and that was another series we did in a few years later on discrimination in healthcare on Long Island. And it was significant in my life, this story, because it was an awakening and a challenging to me to do something. And journalism became one of the ways that I thought we could change this. So now, fast forward to 2 years ago, and Newsday has retold this story in a way that we wanted to tell it at that point, except we got told no by our editor, and I'm not faulting him. He was a great editor. Newsday has recently, about 2 years ago, won the Polk Award, which is one of the top awards in journalism, for a series on a pattern of discrimination by realtors, in which they hired trained testers, videoed them, secret cameras, the whole bit. At the time we did this series 30 years ago, a couple of us who are the editors on it approached the editor of the paper and said, can we do testing? And we talked about the journalism ethics. And at that point, it was like, no, because that's misrepresentation of who you are. We knew we wouldn't truly get at the truth of housing discrimination without testing. So now they've done it. It's a lot of action has happened. They focus their story more narrowly than we focus it on all aspects of life on Long Island affected by segregation. They focused it on realtors, and there's been action taken, but it's basically a continuum of the same story. And I was really pleased to see them do that. So it was told very differently, of course, in all ways. There was video, there was a documentary and video. There were, sort of shots of how they set up the cameras, the whole thing, how they did it. It was clearly had a major online presence. We were, fairly primitive. We had interviewed dozens of African Americans, and we ran them in their own voices, but not with video. Print, it would have been much more powerful with video. So I think overall this would be a much more powerful story today because of the way it's being told in a multimedia way. I think my one fear in redoing this story, and I don't know what happened at Newsday, is the kind of reaction it would invoke in the community from racists, from white racists, and what you do with that, and how you deal with message, how you deal with all the comments. How do you convene the community? Is there a way in which the paper can bring the community together over this? So I think that would be the only thing that might be more difficult. Yes, we got letters after we published it 30 years ago that were pretty racist, but people had to sign their names in those days, and there wasn't any of this anonymous online commenting back and forth and really attacking people personally. But I'd much rather be telling the story today overall because of all the multimedia that would be available to us, and also doing the testing, making your point and proving it.
Charlotte, that's an interesting point. I'd like to ask Bridget to reflect on this, actually. Bridget Williams, Senior Vice President of Hearst Digital, who has a strong digital background. The digital world gives us so many storytelling options, but there is that interactivity, which is both a blessing and a curse. Could you talk a little bit about both the power and the danger of that kind of reader interaction these days?
Yeah, that's, when Charlotte was speaking, that's my mind immediately went there, of course. There's two things in that storytelling that we now think about in digital very differently, right? It is the promotion and distribution of that story has to be part and parcel of the creation of the story. You know, when I remember when Houston Chronicle was ready to publish the Southern Baptist Convention, another very hot topic. And there was a war room, and the war room was not about the production of the story. It was about what was happening. At what time was it going to go on Twitter? At what time was it going to go on Facebook? Who was going to tweet it? What was the headline? What was the message? Who was moderating? And so it's very powerful. You know, there was as many people thinking about how to get that story out digitally, deliver that story, and mitigate. You know, you can't put something on social unless you're prepared to moderate it and be there. And you have to have an official line of what are we going to say? You have to think through, what are we going to say when a racist shows up in comments? Are we going to delete everything, or are we going to respond? And so it is part of the game. And it's also, per Charlotte also, it's a much more powerful tool when you can engage. It's just a lot more work. And so turning off comments, turning off the community, it's just, they're going to have the conversation with or without you. And do you want to be in the middle there and, you know, getting rid of the hate and allowing communication? In a previous job, all of our reporters were required to moderate and respond to the comments on their own stories. I don't know in a newsroom, Rex, if that's possible, right? Everyone is so overworked, but it was a good way to have the voice of the person be interacting on that particular story.
Think about that, Brian Mann. Now you're at NPR, where your audience is much larger, of course, than it was at NCPR. Those of us who have followed your reporting would be interested to know the way that you might now be interacting with listeners differently from the way that you used to, and if there's a difference then in your storytelling, knowing that.
Yeah, thanks, Rex. You know, it's really interesting. I, after spending most of my career as a rural journalist in small public radio stations across the country and here at North Country Public Radio, I actually feel like I developed a relationship with the audience that I have pretty carefully and deliberately carried with me to NPR. So I don't necessarily run into all those people in the grocery store or at Stewart's. But I do sort of think of it in sort of a metaphorical way, that's sort of what's happening. And I know that's kind of a construct. There's certainly a lot more ugliness online at the national level, although the North Country can get pretty feisty at times. But I have to say, you know, one thing that's really interesting to me, hearing, you know, Bridget and Charlotte and also your introduction, I've really found, as I've moved through my career, and let me just say as a quick sort of where it began for me, I grew up on an island in Alaska where, when I was a little boy, we had one very good local newspaper that does still exist. But I remember when the public radio station came in, and it changed the culture of my community. It opened beyond what the local paper was able to do, that new voice and that new source of thinking and different kinds of points of view really enriched the world. And then I saw when talk radio came into rural America, and then when cable, and then ultimately, you know, digital revolution came into small towns. And it's been really challenging for me to sort of try to evolve with that as the communities that I love most dearly changed over those times. I will say that while it's a perilous time for storytellers like us and for people who believe in telling accurate and true stories, in general, I have found it to be largely an exhilarating and kind of exciting moment of reinvention. And I know that that's sometimes hard to hear in parts of the reporting and journalism industry that are really taking it right on the chin right now. You know, there is a lot of very painful churn in the business. Some of it's doing wounds to our ability to cover stories that are going to take a long time to sort out. But those are real, and those are really scary. But I do think the flip side of it, as you heard kind of what Charlotte and Bridget were saying, I think that there are some incredibly exciting ways that we're engaging with audiences, ways that our newsrooms are being forced to reflect our communities better. I mean, we all, kind of came up in very white newsrooms, very male-dominated newsrooms, newsrooms that were not often really reflecting the communities that we were trying to cover. And I think in part, this revolution that has knocked us all back on our heels a little bit has also forced us to think about storytelling differently and challenged our assumptions. And beyond the risks to our livelihoods that sometimes brings, it is also really challenging to think how to get these stories right, how to be ethical in new ways. And that's, I lose a lot of sleep thinking about that stuff, but at the same time, it's a pretty exciting, I think of it, just one last thought. I think journalism, from the earliest times that people started writing in the sort of the vein of trying to accurately reflect the world, it's been through many profound evolutions where totally different approaches were used. And we're in one of those moments now where it's really going to be interesting to see where this all leads. A lot of it's going to be ugly, but there could also be some really, really beautiful and exciting and refreshing things that come from it. I certainly hope so.
The kind of ugliness does sometimes come up. I want Bob Worth to focus on this for just a second, because so much of your reporting for the Times and now is on the Middle East, which is such a controversial spot. I remember a few years ago, a buddy of mine became the Jerusalem bureau chief and was immediately subjected to sort of a character assassination. And I wonder to what extent we in journalism, in becoming sort of part of the story, risk losing credibility. With Donald Trump attacking journalists who are covering him, with journalists taking a much more active, offering a much more active voice in what they're covering. What's the effect of that in your reporting? How does that sort of interactivity and the journalists themselves becoming part of the story a factor in what you're doing?
Well, I think it's a real danger. And I think one of the things that exacerbates it is the ubiquity now of Twitter and Slack and Facebook, that, reporters are out there as they never have been before. And they start expressing opinions, and that turns into mini controversies, and they get exposed in ways that aren't really good for them. I actually think that, this is one of those ridiculous quixotic ideas that is never going to be adopted, but I think it'd be better for all these major news organs if they told their reporters to stop tweeting and to stop. Slack is the other medium that people express opinions on, but it happens constantly, these little mini controversies, and I think that stuff is up there forever, right? It's never going to go away. It's always, anyone who wants to do a character assassination can always dredge up something on what you've said on Twitter or Facebook, which is something you probably said at a fit of pique, So I think that's a danger. In terms of my career, it's funny, I was trying to think of an example of a story that I would do differently today. It's a little hard to do because, I write about the Middle East mostly, and that's certainly changed in a lot of ways, but it doesn't touch on these kinds of currents you've been talking about. One obvious thing for me is that a lot of the places I report on, I can literally no longer go to because they are completely caught up in wars, or they're being run by hostile regimes, or I've been blacklisted by several countries and I literally can't enter. But I think what I was thinking I might do is, instead of talking about one of my own stories, tell a little story about the New York Times that might be kind of instructive. Because I think one of the dangers, along with, as you mentioned, the involvement of reporters and all these things, is political polarization. And what that's done to our media. When I started at the Times 20 some years ago, there was a guy there who had an important job. He was called the standards editor. His name was Al Siegel. He was a very large, very dignified man who walked around, in this kind of popish way. And his role was taken very, very seriously. He was basically in charge of maintaining the Times' standards and everything from how you use a semicolon to basic journalistic ethics. And there was a whole architecture beneath him that was distributed. There were things called greenies, which were, after the paper came out, they would somebody would jot down all the mistakes we'd made. And these would be distributed to every desk. And they took it seriously. You had to look and say, okay, well, how did we violate our standards and how can we do better next time? And then there were copy editors, dozens and dozens of them, who were sort of marinated in all these standards and had to memorize them. And that was the last person who saw your story before it was printed. And they would, cite these like the Bible to you, you can't say this or you must say that or whatever. And as a young reporter, it felt kind of pedantic and heavy sometimes. You kind of wanted to say, must we be so, incredibly hyper cautious about everything? And with the politics of it too, I felt like saying, come on, everybody knows we're a liberal paper. Why can't we just come out and say it, But I think ultimately, what all that architecture did and the presence of, Al Siegel and all this seriousness about getting it right, I think it did force everybody to be more vigilant about their biases, whatever those might be. And now all that stuff is gone. There's no Al Siegel. I don't think there's any greenies. There's all the copy editors have been fired. And I think two things have happened. Number one, the Times, which wanted so much to be aiming itself at the big political middle of the country. Well, the country, the middle is smaller than it was, and we've polarized, right? So there's enormous pressure to go for one side or the other, and that's what happens, right? You have Fox News and you have the liberal media, which I think, and Trump, of course, really exacerbated this in a terrible way, so that the Times, I think the Times faced really tough decisions every day during Trump. Well, not just the Times, every big institution did, but I know the editor of the paper, Dean Baquet, very well, and I didn't envy him that job. I mean, you had to pay attention to the fact that important norms of our country and our Constitution were being violated every day. But if you reported obsessively on him, as the Times often did, with 3 or 4 front page stories about him, you were playing into his schemes, right? I mean, you were becoming a mirror of this obsessive political culture. And that, I think, got very unhealthy. And the other thing that happened to the Times was that its whole economic model changed from being based on advertising, which allowed you to, when people wrote in, as they always did, I'm canceling my subscription. You could afford to not care that much. Well, now you have to care, especially if a whole bunch of them do, because now the money comes from subscriptions, not from ads. I hope I said that right. It used to come from ads. Now it comes from subscriptions. And so we're now more beholden to the reader. And we're also, all the editors of the paper are constantly watching Twitter and Slack and Facebook and so forth. And I worry that, the paper's been pushed to become, under Trump, I think it was sort of a newspaper of the resistance. And now it's, a committed sort of progressive paper, much, much more than it was. And I think it's just harder to, there's a lot of pressure within the paper. There was a lot of outrage over Trump, understandably, right? But that has translated, I think, into a real intolerance for hearing ideas that you disagree with. So within the paper, there's been these kind of scandals where people have been forced out for giving voice to that. The op-ed editor, who was a friend of mine, a really revered journalist named James Bennett, last June, he ran an op-ed by Tom Cotton, the senator, that a lot of people took exception to. At the time, there were surveys suggesting that op-ed was actually very, very popular among the American public. It was an op-ed that called for using troops to quell the riots in the wake of the whole George Floyd thing. Well, I, like a lot of other people, did not like that op-ed, but you had to recognize that, it was voicing some sentiment out there that had a lot of support. Well, he was fired for having printed that op-ed, forced out of the paper, not exactly fired. And it just became an example of the danger. I mean, it's a strange thing, because on the one hand, the biggest dangers to me are the ones that Rex, you and and others were talking about as we prepare for this gathering, you know, the fact that there are so many people who don't believe in really important basic facts about global warming and so forth, right? I mean, that's the thing that I'm most concerned about. And yet we've become so polarized that we're preaching to the converted often within our little bubbles, right? And that we're writing for people at the Times who accept our point of view. The people we need to reach aren't reading the Times at all anymore. You know, they've junked their subscriptions. They now watch Fox. And so the big challenge is, how do you reach across the aisle and to them?
I think that's an interesting point. I'd like to bring in Adam Federman on this, because Adam writes for an independent news organization, a not-for-profit newsroom. Let me see if I say this right. That we used to know of as the Nation Institute, right? Which comes from a progressive background. Yet the investigative reporting I've always thought was fully factually based. I don't have any reason to doubt the accuracy of what I read by what's produced by your newsroom type, as now called. Adam, do you think that the rise of newsrooms that are identified by, say, ideology and background is a benefit in the sense of transparency of people knowing what they are, or is it a detriment in that people are only going to the places where they feel comfortable?
Just to clarify one thing, I am a reporting fellow with Type Investigations, it's called now, which was formerly known as the Investigative Fund at the Nation Institute. And the Nation Institute grew out of a partnership with the Nation magazine, but they were always separate entities. And Type Investigations actually doesn't produce any of its own original reporting, but collaborates with other publications. So all of my reporting is actually done in partnership with other magazines like Politico, Wired, Washington Post. But that part of the reason why they changed their name, I think, is because they wanted to get away from the automatic characterization that they had some sort of relationship with the Nation magazine. But I think here, the larger question is getting at this idea of whether the view from nowhere still has any legitimacy and relevance in journalism today. And I think it's come under a great deal of valid criticism. Most notably, I think Jay Rosen at NYU has explored this question at length. The idea that the overriding objective and goal of a journalism organization or newsroom is to be impartial and to make sure that they give equal weight to both sides, even if one side is claiming something that's completely inaccurate, like climate change is a hoax, as Trump famously said when he was a candidate. So I think that is a question that news organizations have struggled with before the last several years, but it sort of came into focus in a way that I think forced major papers to in a sense, call a lie, and figure out how to, I think, take a more vocal position on some of these issues. You can't really give equal space to climate denial in an age when we understand the science and we know sort of where we're headed. And if we don't deal with this issue in a way that is based on the science today, we're going to be in a whole hell of a lot of trouble 20, 30, 50, 100 years down the road.
Yeah, true. It's actually, it sets up the moment for a great tough question for Tom Curley, who used to run the Associated Press, which has had this reputation of being the place you would go for straightforward information when even no one else might have been there. The Associated Press was always the trustworthy source. It is much harder, I would think, nowadays to be the AP, because even because you're pulled on the one side to be step away from what Adam referred to as the journalism of nowhere, you know, that is the term that we hear in journalism now, storytelling that seems to not have an ideological origin. You're pulled to step away from that for truth telling, and yet if you lose the credibility that the AP has always had as the straight storyteller, you risk losing your franchise. So what would you do if you were still running a place, Tom?
Well, I'd have to be careful. I'm not sure I want to answer that last question directly, but Rex, let me say that AP still has a standards editor. It still serves conservative customers and liberal customers. Its copy is reviewed by literally tens of thousands of people in newsrooms around the world. It's video, it's every product is still assembled, it goes out, it's published and reviewed. So some of the standards are still in play. And I think there are some different shifts or nuances here. Nearly all the media struggled with how to cover the lies starting in a big way in 2017. Although to be fair, every administration has at least told some stories and pushed it aside as long as all of us have been around, right? You know, propaganda was started by Woodrow Wilson. That whole propaganda discipline goes back to World War I. So it's been around for a while. But, you know, it's still about figuring out how to tell the story. And the facts are the facts. And you can get to where the facts are. Right now, we do have a credibility crisis. And that's because a group of people are trying to undermine journalism, but let's be fair too, not just journalism, all kinds of institutions for their own gain. So we're not alone, but I think you can still operate sticking to the facts, not being naive at all. You still have to do the hard reporting and be tough about what's right and what's fair. If a story, much of it is literally still straight reporting. You go somewhere, you talk to some people, here's what happened. And you do that. If there's certainly going to be thousands of people that will deny that there's climate change or any other story, but you can still do your job. You know what the facts are. The most important thing is to make sure you write what you know and not to go beyond and write things you don't know. And I think there are standards of how to perform on breaking news that have been with AP since 1846, and they're still with AP in 2021. So I think that part is what you can navigate. The tougher part is the commercial pressures, and people will take the copy and change it. I mean, I remember calling one editor who was manipulating copy politically and said, okay, you can do that. You have that right. You just got to take the AP slug off that story. You know, you just can't blame us for that colorization. So, you know, you still have to do things like that.
So I want to turn to the one panel member we haven't talked to yet, Brandon Loomis, the editor of the Explorer. Much of your career, Brandon, has been spent covering environmental issues. And this is, it is interesting to have been watching over the last couple of years to have seen this quiet shift, it seems to me, even on the right, in the recognition of climate change, whereas as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, the right was still insisting it wasn't real, that this wasn't actually happening. Something that I think you were dealing with a decade ago in your reporting. And I'm wondering the extent to which telling hard stories like that, well, let me put it this way, the extent to which story selection and the reporting that your newsrooms have engaged in has been guided by a sense we have to tell this truth, even if an awful lot of people don't believe it's true. Is it easier to tell climate change stories nowadays than it used to be? And do you think there are other stories that are like that people just don't want to hear the truth of yet?
Yeah, it's certainly, I mean, I feel that it's easier. There's been a shift, I think, throughout the business, throughout the media, toward, it's kind of like what we've been talking about here tonight with, you know, calling a lie, I think a lot of the media have just decided that we're going to tell it like it is now and not try to act like both sides of this question are equal. And a decade ago, I was working at the Salt Lake Tribune in Utah, and I spent several months working on a project about how the climate change there and throughout the West was affecting the die-off of forests of millions of acres that were being affected by pine beetles and other beetles that were killing trees. And these were native beetles, not invasive species, but they were getting into areas that they wouldn't normally have been into, high in the mountains, where it was normally in the past too cold for them in the winter to survive. And I made a conscious decision at that point, partly based on where I was working in Utah. When I would go around and ask questions about the effects of climate change, there would be some giggling, from some of the public officials who I felt at the time understood, but just knew that they weren't supposed to talk about that. So when I approached that story, I stuck to what I knew. I stuck to what I could prove, and I talked to dozens of scientists along the way. I think you could probably make a case that I over-reported it because I wanted it to be on solid ground. The other thing that I did was I stuck to what I could say had happened or was happening, and not what people were projecting would happen in the future. And the effect was we got a lot of response, and I didn't get a lot of response that you might expect from people who were questioning it. I think today I would not feel so sheepish about diving into that story and feeling like I had to back it up so much, because there's been such a shift in the way we report these things generally across the media, and there is now a greater comfort in just saying this is our reality, and going with it and trusting that. So at the Explorer, we certainly believe in climate change, so we don't have any problem with telling stories that and we have anytime we put a climate change story online, and on Facebook in particular, we hear from, usually it's a number of people that we recognize their names. People don't buy it, that's fine, but I guess we kind of have the luxury of having an audience that cares about these things. That's the nature of our publication. So we still have to back it up with the reporting, but I don't feel as much discomfort about it as I might have 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think we've all learned something about how often facts can lie. People don't understand that. Actually, here's an interesting comment from one of our participants from one of the audience here in the chat space, which you're all welcome to use. Reporters print the truth, Phil says, without the need to curry favor or convince. You create a record which reflects your integrity. It's a wonderful notion, and I believe it. The difficulty is when facts sometimes aren't the truth. I reach back many years to when George Pataki first became governor. Some of you may remember that far back. And I was the managing editor of the Times Union at the time, not yet running the newsroom. And I was asked to moderate a panel at the annual meeting of the Business Council of New York State at the Sagamore Resort, one on Lake George, not the Great Camp. And I remember going up there on the night that the governor came up for this great banquet before hundreds of business leaders of New York State. And he talked about how he had turned around the economy of New York State. He'd been the governor for 9 months. Pataki was a tall guy, arms stretched out like this. And I remember him saying, what a turnaround, what a story. And our reporter who was there covering it, I was just there for the event I was moderating, a reporter who was there quoted the governor saying that. What a turnaround, what a story. But it struck me that it was odd because New York State was at that time, if it were an independent country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. I thought that was quite something that George Pataki could turn around the state economy in 9 months. Big guy, but that's a big job. And so we eventually did deep reporting to determine whether it was true. And we got 3 different econometric consulting firms to tell us what indices we ought to use. And we found the 7 different metrics. We found that on 5 of the 7 metrics, by the time we got the story done, it was 2 years later because the editor I was working for at the time didn't want to do it. It took us a while to get it done. On 5 of the 7 metrics, the state actually was doing better in the last 18 months of Mario Cuomo's administration and the first 18 months of George Pataki's. So we quoted the governor accurately. We told the facts of what he said. What a turnaround, what a story. But the truth was not told in the facts. The truth was not told by what we had covered. So when readers tell us, just tell me the facts and let me decide, it's not that easy. If your charge is, as the first tenet of the Code of Ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists says, seek the truth and report it fully. If your charge is to tell the truth, it's often not found in just the facts. And, you know, I'm wondering, Brian, you're now telling stories primarily about addiction. And this is a story that has taken on such resonance in recent years. And I wonder if there's a different way I wonder if the way that you are telling these stories now could have been done a few years ago, or if the way that society has begun to think about addiction has so changed that it makes your storytelling different as well, you know?
Yeah, I think fundamentally different. I mean, one of the things that I'm in the middle of a big, deep research project right now that is exploring the fact that in kind of the typical experience of a white American, addiction is largely viewed as a treatable chronic disease. Very challenging, often debilitating, but treatable, and there's a system in place. Whereas still for many, many people of color, Black Americans, but also Hispanic Americans, the system that remains in place even today is one largely of criminalization and stigma. The response is most often, police and still remarkably a high level of incarceration. And so one of the things, Rex, that's fascinating about this moment for me is that I'm in a field where I'm not quite where Brandon's field is at, where, climate, there is a near universal consensus, certainly a total consensus in the scientific community, but a broadening consensus that climate is, climate change is real and it's something that we need to be reacting to. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about the last 20 years for journalists is that we are in this landscape that has evolved really fundamentally. So like I'm dealing with the question of addiction and people with substance use disorder and how we conceptualize that human condition. But think about people who are gay or people who are transgender or people who come from different racial or immigration backgrounds. I mean, we as journalists have evolved very rapidly in the way that we tell those stories, the way that we think about those human lives. And I do think that one of the things that's really challenging is that so many people in our audience have not followed where many of our stories have taken us. Many of the responses that I get, and I'll just come back to my addiction area, I'll tell factual, scientific, deeply researched pieces looking at the brain science of addiction, the illness of addiction. And the response that I get often from audiences is stigma, shame, anger, fear, and so it's a very challenging thing to be in a storytelling climate where we are often reflecting a a culture that is evolving very rapidly and are thinking about these complicated issues of family, what it means to be Christian, non-Christian. We're in a very dynamic society where different chunks of that society are seeing the world very differently, almost year by year. So yeah, I could not, about 10 years ago, I did a project with North Country Public Radio called the Prison Time Media Project, where I looked at addiction issues through the lens of mass incarceration. And I would never do that project the same way today. It was a very different time. I had a very different level of experience, and certainly the science has evolved, the fact base has evolved. And that's something that's really challenging.
Boy, let me just ask Bridget something, because you're so good, Bridget, at figuring out ways to tell stories. Just put you on the spot. This addiction issue, what Brian primarily reports on, is such a multifaceted story, and as Brian is saying, a lot of the audience, a lot of the consumers of the story don't see it the same way that the journalists and the scientists they're quoting do. Do you have any storytelling suggestions that would reveal something for our group here about the realities of new journalism, how we might do this better?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brian is probably thinking through that every day. But there's putting yourself in the shoes of the person is a very hard task, but it's a very humanizing thing to do. And so, the Times does a very good job of how would you spend if you were making the minimum wage? Show us how you would spend it, right? Those sorts of interactives that allow you to say, all right, so if you can take someone through the addiction journey and have them make those decisions. Same thing, a poverty journey. Go to the grocery store with $10 and get dinner, right? Those sorts of things that are very, like, obviously addiction is a very complicated and complex issue, but if you can boil it down to some simplicity that allows someone to open their eyes in a minute. And then, as Charlotte mentioned, powerful digital tools, right? Storytelling, hearing the voice, seeing the person, for those that choose to share their stories publicly. There's no better place. I probably feel a little more bullish about the internet than some on the call, but you can humanize a person in such a different way. And, so you have the humanity of that, and then you have the tools to put someone in the place. And I think that's all you can do. I'm sure Brian has more to say on that.
Yeah, it really does open up storytelling opportunities. About 5 years ago at the Times Union, we did a big package on addiction but in order to do it well, we had to partner with a TV station. So we partnered with WMHT Public Television. They did beautiful work visually that we ourselves could not have done, just because our base is ink on crushed trees. We're all learning in the newspaper world, but it's and part of it goes to the question of hiring, which I wanted to get back to Charlotte on, because Charlotte and I have both done an awful lot of hiring in newsrooms over the years. And I wonder, Charlotte, you would probably be hiring differently now, although, we had commitments to diversity in hiring, but it is a difficult thing to find journalists who can really tell all of these stories. If you were an editor now, what do you think you might be doing differently in terms of shaping your newsroom and the people who are actually doing the journalism?
I think that the young journalists are coming out of an era where they are digitally capable, and they may need a little training along the way. But I would say that every journalist that comes into the newsroom today needs to have, certainly basic skills in internet and social media and video, and it's really crucial. It's the toolbox. I mean, just like I used to have to know how to type, and then they now have to know how to do video, make video, and tell stories, not just the technical, but how to tell stories in a compelling way. What is the best medium to tell this story? And, I would also, of course, be trying to build a newsroom that looked like my community in terms of its racial, ethnic makeup. And I think we tried very hard at Newsday and had some success. But, we had a long way to go. Almost all news organizations have a long way to go. And also, of course, gender and, who sits in the seats where decisions are made. So it's very complicated. I wanted to allude to one other point, though, if I can slightly change the conversation a little bit, Rex. And because I've been reading the chat too, and some of the chat deals with local journalism. And so as we began this conversation, we began with Newsday, which was a big, rich local paper, but nonetheless local. And then moved into like more discussion of the national media, particularly the Times from Bobby, and media that deal with national news primarily, which is extremely, as we know, polarized. But I have always been a lover of local news above all. And there are indications, I read a study recently that people tend to believe their local papers more than national papers and more than national television. So there's a credibility issue of I live where you live and I know you, and you can trust me. And I'm not saying they love Newsday, but local media does have trust because it's local. And I think the biggest tragedy in media right now is not the polarization and not what the New York Times faces or the Washington Post, but what local news faces. We have the death. We have we're in a death spiral in terms of the financial model for local news. And we've been in this death spiral since, when I arrived at the Orlando Sentinel in 2004, there were 335 people in the newsroom. When I left, there were 170, half. And since then, I'd say it's another half. So it's probably down to 70. And there's a great columnist, Margaret Sullivan, whom some of you may know. She was the editor for years of the Buffalo News, and now is the Washington Post media columnist. And she's written a book called Ghosting the News. And it's not just about the papers that have folded. And yes, more than 2,000 local papers have folded in the last decade, leaving many communities with no paper, as you said, Rex. But beyond that, the newsrooms that are left have been what Sullivan calls ghosted. They've been cut to shreds and they can't do what they need to do anymore. So where is there hope in all this? Well, I think there's hope in nonprofit journalism that has arisen out of the ashes of the business model of local journalism. And it's doing well. And it's like one day some of the funders out there of, various journalistic things and other civic-minded people have suddenly woken up that there's no local news in America. There's going to be no local news in America unless we find a different way to support it, unless we find a different model. And so, the Explorer is an example of that model. It's local. It's supported by readers. Yes, it has advertising, and that's great. And yes, it has a nice, beautiful, glossy magazine, which I trust all of you read. But it also has a very active online storytelling capacity that has greatly improved over the last, say, 5-6 years. But it rests on the philanthropy of both individuals and organizations that see this as a basic, necessity to have good local news. Communities do not thrive without it. In fact, there's a South Carolina paper, one of the ones remaining, that's doing a series very recently about what's happened in communities in South Carolina where newspapers have gone away. Well, there's more corruption. Well, there's no one minding the store. There's no one going, actually, taxes have gone up. There's no one minding the everyday business of the most basic level of government services. And so to me, that's really the problem that journalism needs to solve, is how to ensure that our communities are served with true factual knowledge about their own communities. So that's what I'm passionate about. I've always been passionate about local news and what it does in its community, that we can sometimes be a little arrogant journalists because we have the First Amendment behind us. But when you go out and face the people you live with, you're honest. You have to be honest.
The title again of Margaret Sullivan's book, one of our participants is asking.
Ghosting the news.
Ghosting the news.
Turning it into a ghost, the newsrooms into ghosts of what they once were.
Yeah. Tom Curley, you've thought a lot about the business of journalism as well. You ran a big enterprise, and I think people don't realize that the Associated Press is actually cooperative. And so it is actually run, in effect, by the newspapers that own it. Is there a model in that for the broader future of community journalism, or do you have any smart ideas about what Charlotte is saying is problematic, that is the sustenance of local news?
So first of all, Rex, none of us solved that problem. and the problem has deepened. So let's be honest about that. The cooperative model for AP, it runs like a business. Only about 17% of revenues come from American newspapers. The majority of the revenues come from broadcast. And that has been the case for decades. So AP is in a different position, and it's been in a helpful position as the newspaper industry is consolidated. So right now, what's out there is you have to make a switch to the not-for-profit model or find a billionaire who's going to bail you out.
Mm-hmm.
Or both.
Or both. Those are the two business models that are emerging in journalism. The Explorer was the third not-for-profit news organization in the country. And so there are many more now, and a lot of people are trying to make that switch. But there's one other important thing, and it's been recognized in the chat and what you said at the beginning. These search engines are taking everybody else's content, and in effect, they're stealing it, and they're not compensating the people for their work. When I went to AP in 2003, I proposed that we form an industry search engine and keep it away from Google. At the time, it's tough to imagine, but Google was a small organization.
Yeah.
Could we have competed with Google? No, but we could have, I think, extended this whole transition another 5 or 10 years if we had been able to do that. But it's a classic case. We were in a very fractionalized industry. Technology came in, and technology companies really do well when the incumbents are fractionalized. They can just crush you, and they have. They've taken the money, they're not compensating, or they're throwing a few pennies out. Australia has just passed a law that possibly starts to change the game. And I don't know what the deal terms are. I don't know who's getting paid how much, whether there's enough money in it. But to get some of that back is an absolute necessity. You have 3 organizations that are taking not only the 70% of the advertising, but they're providing an enormous service. We've had politicized media since the 1700s in America. What's been different lately is that these platforms have weaponized the politics, in some cases, behind it. And some of the standards, we all have been gatekeepers. We decide what gets published, what's a fact, what's not a fact. And in some ways, that has not been good. The democratization of the news that has resulted, opening up to others, sounded like a good idea when the internet came along. Obviously, perhaps it's gone too far. So there needs to be a discussion, there needs to be a shift, but those who are providing the news need to get some compensation. And unless they do, the trend is going to continue and there's going to be nothing left.
So I wonder if I should ask panelists for any other solutions. I mean, Tom points to an interesting notion of perhaps statutorily reacting to this. That is a law that, as is now the case going forward in Australia, just taking effect, that would require the search engines to compensate the originators of content. So there's an economic model that could provide some cash influx. But the other question involves the credibility issue. Charlotte notes that local has more credibility, but I can tell you, having been a local editor for, well, it's been 30 years now that I've been running upstate newsrooms, that I think that we get our own share of attacks. People are not always friendly locally. I
didn't say they were friendly.
So I just wonder if any of you would like to offer some thoughts on how news organizations might rebuild trust, gain credibility, enhance their capacity to survive in their own markets, whether they're local or national. Anybody want to offer thoughts here? Bridget's got one. What do you do?
Rex, it's ironic because when we went and did consumer surveys, market by market, when we got to Albany, the people that we surveyed and had in the focus groups were just unflailingly sympathetic, and these were randomly generated. And we compared that to San Francisco and Houston, where there was much mistrust. And I believe what Charlotte said. They knew you. They knew the reporters and the editors. The editors were at their basketball game. You know, it was a big enough newsroom in a small enough community that you were part of the community. And I think it was so astounding after watching. I would put the focus groups on Alexa over the weekend while I was cleaning, and it was a really dark time for me. Hours and hours of vitriol, and then we got to the Albany tapes, and it was like it was like a birthday party. So there's a lesson in that, and I think it is. You put a question out there to us, which is should reporters and editors be involved in the community? And the answer is they are part of the community already. And so, yes, lean into that more and more. I might take a different view than Tom and some others here. More transparency, more out there. When you know someone, you trust them, and when you know their kid and you've seen them, it's just going to develop a different relationship. And by the way, that is something that local news can do that the New York Times cannot do. We can reach out and touch and talk, and we should use that to our advantage.
When I just quickly, the New York Times has done something I think is brilliant, which is to have that story about how the Times got its story, an important story, on page 2.
Right.
And what a wonderful conversation, and ideal for its readership. How I got this story. At least I think they can keep it, but it's wonderful.
Page 2 is such an anachronism. That's actually it's paper, right?
Yes.
Sorry. But what if you're Adam Federman and you have a national story and you're not necessarily a part of that community? Adam, is there a way that even in your news organization you are able to reach out and make in touch your consumers, your readers?
It's a tricky question. I mean, I've actually been doing a lot of reporting on Alaska for the last 2 years, and public lands management under the Trump administration. So I'm following issues, obviously, that are very far afield from where I live, which means I have to engage with the local news media in Alaska as much as I can and try to understand the dynamics that are evolving and unfolding there, which are quite complex and very different from not only from where I live, but I think the rest of the country in some ways, in terms of resource development and understanding battles over a place like the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, which in the lower 48, at least, according to the polls that we have, most Americans are opposed to. In Alaska, it's a very different story, and that goes back to statehood and the history of resource development in the country. So for me, that's been a learning curve, getting a better sense of why Alaskans are much more gung-ho about developing a place like the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, among other resource development issues in the state. But I would say it's very challenging with, just speaking personally, with the stories that I do, to engage with readers in that particular place or community. And I don't tend to approach my stories from that sort of vantage point. It's more about the investigation and sort of what I can bring to bear, in that regard.
Bobby Worth, the Times, are you, so the Times has this vast audience, 4 million digital subscribers now, and, a global reach. But the question of credibility remains. How are you charged? How are you asked by the leaders of your newsroom to consider building credibility? Can you, or is that not something that you're supposed to worry about as a reporter?
It hasn't really been something, and I have to say, I wish that I had more of a local connection. Because I'm writing about, I end up getting a lot of letters, in response to my pieces from people living in other countries. The only local community I suppose I have is that I live in Washington, D.C., and there's think tanks here that deal with some of these questions, and they're down the street, but it's not exactly neighbors. Yeah, I think it's something all journalists have to think about. It's maybe now more than ever, but it's not really part of my day-to-day brief.
Not part of your, yes, Brian.
Rex, I have I guess kind of a complicated feeling about this. And let me say that it kind of breaks down very briefly into a couple of parts. First of all, I grew up in rural America and in very conservative parts of rural America. And one of the things that I think is a bit of an illusion is that this credibility problem is something that's new. I think that there's always been an enormous tension between the stories that we tell and the facts and the evidence-based reporting that we do, and the comfort that people are going to have with that. And that leads me to my second point, which is I really revere journalism that doesn't need to be liked very much. And, if my reporting holds up under scrutiny, and I fight this out online all the time, come at me hard and kick me hard, but you better have the facts. And if you've got the facts, I'll correct my reporting immediately. But if you're just sniping at me because you are having fun, that's not a good give and take. And so, frankly, one of the things that worries me a little bit right now is this hunger to be liked. And as a kind of this part I want to hold on to as an old school journalist. One of the first experiences I had as a small town reporter was somebody coming at me profanely, accusing me of sleeping with farm animals. He was so angry at me, and it took a layer of skin off, and yet it taught me that my job is not to be liked. And that brings me to my third point, and this is how this interacts, is given that journalism has to be contrarian, it has to be willing to tell stories that piss people off and that scare people and that make people uncomfortable and that push the envelope of what they understand about the world, because that's what we're doing, right? When I go to a Black Lives Matter protest and try to really understand what's happening on the street, that's going to be a new experience to somebody who's sitting at home in Duluth, not because I'm smarter than they are or that I have any kind of a different, level of intelligence or something like that. It's just that it's my job to go and try to figure out what's happening, right? And so when I bring that information back as the messenger, that's going to make people uncomfortable. And here's my final point, is that because we're often disliked and because our business model just blew up in our faces, these things are suddenly very scary. Being disliked at a time when we're under attack and when we don't have shoppers and car lot ads that support what we do, it makes it really hard for us to continue. The place where I'm really maybe falsely optimistic is I do believe that at the end of the day, this thing we do is precious and that people do in large quantities hunger for it. That business model blew up spectacularly, flamed out, like a firework. But I do believe that we're already seeing, maybe not yet at the local journalism level that Charlotte was talking about, and I agree, that's very scary right now. But I do think like projects like the one Adam's involved with and lots of other experiments right now in how to put really great journalism together. 1,000 flowers are blooming right now, and a lot of them are going to die. A lot of them are in arid soil, I think, but some of them are going to work. And 20 years from now, it's going to be really interesting. But I bet you a nickel that there are still going to be people out there telling stories, pissing people off, telling uncomfortable truths, and hopefully earning a paycheck in the process. That last part I'm not entirely sure about, but I am hopeful. But a big piece of that is not, from my point of view, is not working terribly hard to be liked. The credibility question sometimes makes me a little anxious, a little nervous.
Charlotte, you're waving.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I used to say at the Orlando Sentinel, if both sides are really mad at me, I'm doing my job. If both the Democrats, if I'm on the shit list of both the Democrats and the Republicans, I'm doing my job. And so what I meant about credibility is not someone loving you, and feeling all warm and fuzzy about you, because that's usually a sign of a really poor paper, frankly, that's serving some special interest. But rather that, that the reporting on local affairs is seen as honest, even if I don't like it, that it's seen as honest. And I think studies have shown that people do believe more of what they read in their local paper than they do in their national papers. And so, the blow up of the business model for local news is really a crisis for this country that's being partially addressed, but only very partially. And everyone somehow thought citizen journalists would arise and solve the problem. That didn't work. That's sort of gossip. And, I'm on my next door, my town thing. And that's just a lot of discussion about where to find a plumber and things like that, and why there's graffiti on the sidewalk. So that's not news, really. And so I think that our real challenge is to, somehow as a society find a way to to have journalism in our communities that's meaningful and, yes, tells very hard stories, but is minding the store constantly. I mean, I'm really, the watchdog role of local journalism cannot be emphasized too much in terms of its influence on a community.
So as we're getting toward the end of this, in the last minutes, I'd like to ask each of you to think about stories that need to be told that haven't been told well enough, or that aren't being told at all, or topics that you think we ought to be learning more about. I used to ask job applicants, if you had 6 months to improve yourself, to make you a better journalist, what would you learn? What would you go after? You would learn something about what the person considered to be their weakness that way, but also you would get some interesting notions of what we ought to pursue. So I wonder if you would each think a little bit, and I'll start with you, Brandon, since you're the sort of the host editor here. Stories that you think we ought to be telling that we're not generally, or what direction you think we ought to be going topically, really. You have something?
Thanks for putting me on the spot.
Just
no,
first.
We've told them all. I mean, I guess this is, we sort of have the luxury of having a magazine that we can spend time, doing good in-depth explanatory reporting for. And I think that that's something that's been lacking in the media generally, that I think it's changing a little bit. I think as there is a shift toward not just nonprofit ownership, but nonprofit support for newspapers, that there's some, it's affording a lot of opportunities for reporters to take time away from daily coverage and drill down into stories that they might not have been able to in the past. But otherwise, I would, my biggest concern, I would just echo what Charlotte said earlier about local news. In particular, what that means is you're always, because we've talked about how subscriptions are helping to pay for large organizations such as the New York Times. It's not so much the case at small town newspapers, but it's just, the dynamic is just not the same. And what the point I'm making is that there's probably always going to be somebody covering Congress, but there's not going to be somebody covering the small town council that I covered when I started, or the suburban counties that I covered, and these are where people's money goes and where people's kids are educated. So, I hope that there's a solution that sort of backs up smaller newspapers in local communities.
So I'm just going to go down the line in the order that I have them on my screen. Nobody else does probably. Tom Curley, what do you see as being something that we ought to be looking at next?
Well, the two big stories to me are the Russian hack. Nobody's explained that. Nobody's really gotten into that, and that's out there, and somebody needs to do some serious reporting on that, the extent of the damage to the US, how much was compromised. The other is, we saw what Trump would do in front of us publicly, but I would have an investigative team really digging up stuff about what the self-dealing or other stuff that might have happened behind the scenes. You're at a point now where you might be able to get people to provide information that they wouldn't previously. But that has got to be a very ripe area. So those are two for quick openers.
Bobby Worth, what should we be doing?
Well, I'm not sure I can offer specific stories, but my first boss in journalism was a wonderful man named Charlie Peters, who is now in his 90s. And he used to talk about how, 100 years ago, or maybe a little less, journalism was maybe less status to the profession. And a lot of reporters were working class. And, as the profession changed, standards in some ways got higher, but people were also, an awful lot of reporters now, they went to good colleges and they, sit around sipping wine at night and watching Netflix, and they're not people who have just a natural affinity for and understanding of poverty. And, it's not that that's a story that isn't being covered, but I just think there's always more room for that. I think it's become a sort of professional liability of journalists at big venues anyway, to just to not pay enough attention to poverty. We've talked an awful lot about race in the past year, and that's very good and very needed. But I think poverty as well is a big one.
Yeah. Charlotte, you're next. Charlotte Hull, what is it that we ought to be looking at?
I go back to my 30 years ago, that I still think race is a story in the United States that needs to be continually told, continually revealed, and with hopes of at some point reaching justice. And now maybe that's journalism with a cause, but okay, I'll go there. So that's what I'd say. And poverty is obviously a huge piece of that, as Bobby points out. But I'd say race in America, race in your community if you're a local journalist.
Adam Federman, topic or area that you think we ought to be looking at?
Yeah, before this panel, I was actually thinking about the last story that I reported in person before the pandemic, and it was actually a story for the Explorer on the childcare shortage in the North Country. And my last reporting trip before everything shut down was to a little preschool in Keene, that is now, I think, one of only 2 options in that town for parents who need childcare. Many families now, both parents are working, and preschool is only half day there, so it leaves a lot of people without any options. Childcare deserts across the North Country, and it's one of many sort of social services that is just woefully inadequate now in the region. And I think this problem is also, nationwide. The social safety net has failed. And in the midst of COVID, the phrase that the pandemic has laid bare the many inequities that are underlying American society has become kind of a cliche. But I think that journalism hasn't done a very good job of explaining how and why we've gotten to the point that we're currently at. Why is it so difficult, next to impossible, for working families in the North Country to find affordable, high quality childcare? The systems are failing, and they're failing badly. And it's fine to do a story that shows what's happening now, but I think we really need to be able to explain the underlying sort of nature of why these systems are no longer functioning. And it certainly touches on the question of inequality. And so I think going forward that journalism has a real role to play in that regard.
Bridget Williams, what's up? What are we missing?
I'm going to encompass what everyone just said and harken back to one of our newsrooms in Texas, who has a bunch of young college-educated writers who are writing about really cool hip hop and taco trucks. And when you look at the demographic of the community, it is increasingly impoverished. It's Latino. It's a lot of immigrants. It's military, young families with very little money. And when you look at our websites, they do not look or feel like it's serving that group. It's serving a sliver of the community. And newspapers have existed with high income, high educated people funding them. And I think it's time that we started looking deeper at all of these things that you all just said: race, rural poverty, and start being a utility for these communities, because that's what newspapers were. They were must read must read because it was important. And I feel like we need to serve a broader base.
And Brian Mann.
I love all of these ideas, and I'm going to sound deeply unserious with my idea in contrast, but I'm going to talk just for a second about a real hobby horse of mine. And it is that while we have to tell these very important stories, and gravely important stories in many cases during the Trump years and with climate, these are heavy things we report on often. But I think it's also really important that journalists rediscover the importance of telling stories that do tell about joy and that describe the full richness of life in the communities that we cover. I think this is a thing that I've fought for I do radio. And so in the newscasts that I've helped to shape, often we don't have joy in them. We don't have moments when people are living good lives, when people are telling good stories about their experience. And here's the reason I say this is important, is because I think sometimes the doom scrolling quality of modern American journalism contributes to what I'm going to call the Trumpist narrative, the narrative that things are so completely shit at this point that we might as well burn it all down, that we might as well throw the baby out with the bathwater. And again, I'm not minimizing any of the very important economic, environmental policy issues that face the country. But when you go into these communities, many of them under incredible duress, that is not the three-dimensional experience that's happening. The three-dimensional experience includes all of these things, but it also includes people finding ways to celebrate, to create, to be artists, to be in love, to be all of these things. And as somebody who always talks about people who are drug addicted, I am scolding myself more than anybody else. We feel joyless too much of the time. We feel like we're not telling that other side of the American experience, the world experience. And so I think that has to get stronger on our, not just on the back page, not just at the end of the newscast, the little feature at the end. I think sometimes it's important to put on the front page, you know, like, I don't know about you guys, but I spent the whole week watching images from the surface of Mars, right? Because I need that. I hunger for that. And you know what? That's not just BS. That's not just nonsense. That's a true story. That's meaningful stuff about our world that is not gloom and death. And so that's one of my little flags that I like to wave, is we got to get the joy and the life back into the deep narrative of the stories we're telling.
Lovely. Well, what a wonderful way to end it, and what a great all-star newsroom this is. Thank you, panelists, for this terrific, thought-provoking conversation, and I thank you and our audience for your thoughts and for joining us tonight. I'm going to turn it back to Tracy with thanks to both Tracy and Natalie for your creativity in coming up with this idea. What a great event this is. Thank you to all of you.
Yes, thank you to all the panelists. This was really inspiring and so interesting. And it felt like 15 minutes, even though we've gone 6 minutes over. So I want to, the Adirondack Center for Writing and Adirondack Explorer want to thank all of you, Rex, Charlotte, Brian, Bridget, Adam, Bobby, Brandon, and Tom. And there also, at the same time, there was a really lively and engaged chat going on in the chat tool. So thank you to all of you who were here, and we really appreciate it. And we'd like to, the Adirondack Center for Writing and Adirondack Explorer would like to work together again. So maybe we'll come up with something else in the future. And also, as a thank you to all of our participants tonight, the door prize is 50% off any subscription to the Explorer, an app, the print and digital together. I've put in the chat the code to use, journalism, sorry, and I'll send that out to everybody in an email also. So thank you again, and hope to see you again soon.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks for having me, Tracy. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you all.
Fantastic evening. Thank you.